and it's the subject about music in Shul. And not music in Shul on Shabbos. We know Orthodox community that doesn't happen. We know that halachically the problem with music being played on Shabbos. The idea of it's not permissible to play instruments on Shabbos, and anything that we can't do, we can't have others do for us on Shabbos. That's the whole idea of what's called Amira La'akum. That which a Jew can't do on Shabbos, a Jew can't ask a non-Jew to do on Shabbos. So, but this came up with regards to that there's been a phenomenon recently of trying to add music to non-Shabbos holiday tefillah prayer gatherings, and in particular slichos. The slichos service before the high holidays, we know that in the Sephardic community, the 30 days before, all of the month of Elul, Ashkenazic community, in the days before the holiday, so at least 4 days, this year was a week. And the slichos begin with a Saturday night slichos gathering. And in some ways, it's kind of the first of the high holiday prayer services that begins to draw a crowd. Rosh Hashanah draws a crowd, Yom Kippur draws a crowd, Yizkor draws a crowd. Slichos, the effort was made to make that something special and to draw a crowd. It's an important concept, the idea of the penitential prayers in general. And so the Saturday night slichos, even though slichos are more accurately said in the hours or the moments before sunrise, the idea of Saturday night slichos began, and the idea that maybe at least if it's far enough into the night, sometimes past midnight. Others felt it could be a little bit earlier. In some communities, the earlier than midnight slichos were a reality to the neighborhoods that people lived in, not interested in going out late at night, so they would start at 10 o'clock, at 11 o'clock. In any event, in recent years, the idea of adding a little bit of music to the slichos service became fashionable in some quarters. Some communities, Orthodox communities, some have always had music in the Orthodox community. Very famously, Rabbi Shlomo Carlebach would daven during the week with guitar. His Hoshana Rabbah service at the Carlebach Shul was known to extend well into the afternoon. I remember being there once. I think it started at 9:30, and I left at 2:30 in the afternoon to catch a train to go home for the holiday, and they were still going strong. But it was more outlier, more on the fringes. And then recently, a number of shuls started to have music with the slichos, and not concerts necessarily before the slichos. That's something that has been seen for a number of years. Very famously, a lot of people in my chevra would say, come to Riverdale, where at the Hebrew Institute of Riverdale, Eli Kranzler would have a very popular slichos concert before slichos. But this year in particular, a number of places decided to have the instruments during the slichos. And some did it because people didn't have patience for a concert before and then to stay for slichos. People would stay for the concert, not for the slichos. So they just figure, combine it into one and then it would happen. But this led to opposition in some corners of the Jewish community. And a couple of those were headlines in some of the Israeli and Jewish media. So source number one, which is from VIN News. VIN News stands for Was is Nayes. Was is Nayes is Yiddish for what's new. So it's obviously a Jewish news portal in the yeshivish and Hasidic community. Source number one, Gedolim released letter opposing musical slichos events. Several Gedolim in Israel, led by Hagon Harav Gershon Edelstein, one of the Lithuanian yeshiva heads, released a statement effectively banning musical slichos events, which have become prevalent in recent years on the first night of slichos. The letter essentially says that what is supposed to be a sacred gathering has become an entertainment event. Here is a translation of the sharply worded text. Regarding those who breach boundaries to change and overturn the sacred gatherings of the Slichos Davening by transforming it into a recreation event by holding Slichos evenings with the participation of singers and orchestras, both in shuls and outside in the streets, who rather than fulfilling shaking and trembling from the days of your coming before Hashem and for judgment, replace the davenings and pleas being practiced in all communities of Israel to prepare and approach the days of judgment with the musical performance while destroying the tradition of Yisrael Saba. Yisrael Saba, obviously Saba is grandfather, so Yisrael Saba is a classic rabbinic expression referring to the traditions of ancient Israel. We hereby call on the organizers, Balei Tefillah and singers, to cease their activities, and we call upon the public not to break any barriers in Kerem Beis Yisrael, the community, the vineyard of Israel, and the merit of the firm stand to protect the sanctity of Israel. May all be blessed with Eksiva v'Chasima Tova for all good and happiness for all days. All right, so it's time to get rid of these musical slichos events. They are a breach in tradition. That was this yeshivish Hasidic letter signed by a number of prominent rabbinic dignitaries led by Rabbi Gershon Edelstein. Of course, you can go online. If you look at the original, there's a whole discussion. Did he sign it? Did he just agree to it? Very often, you don't really have much by the way of direct communication with some of these rabbinic sages. There's often an intermediary who will tell you what the person says, but you don't necessarily always go straight to the rabbi's mouth. But that's this was widespread in the Orthodox community, ultra-Orthodox community. And then another headline from Israel National News. This is the Arutz Sheva network. And this is from Rabbi Ben-Zion Mutzafi, one of the leading Sephardic rabbis, right? One of the greatest poskim of the Sephardi world, has sharply attacked the practice of holding musical slichot events and called for them to be stopped. In his response, which was published on the Israel Haredi website, Rabbi Mutzafi wrote, "Slichot with musical accompaniment is like eating milk and meat together." Wow. Because the practice of reciting slichot was instituted in order to arouse heavenly mercy upon us and not in order to listen to music with concerts and entertainment. It is a disgrace that there are people who exploit the slichot in this way in order to bring themselves fame and renown. As for the question itself, he was asked, your mother's not permitted to listen to music during her year of mourning. It was kind of a extension. It was a simple question about listening to live music during the year of Eilut, and it was this time of year, so it digressed into the subject. And that's pretty harsh. It's like eating milk and meat together. Not sure it's where that comes from, but it's clearly something that seems to be a major breach of tradition. Now, there are a couple of things that we should do to unpack the opposition. First, in general, what is the rabbinic or halachic attitude towards music or instruments during prayer as a topic? Do we have any precedent, as well as just to unpack the idea of music? When is music permitted or not allowed? I think that, what are some of the sources involved in that? So we just finished the Sukkot holiday, and the Mishnah in Sukkot, in source number 3, provides us with a precedent for the fact that the pious men and women, the pious and the men of action would dance before the people who attended the celebration. This is the Simchat Beit HaShoeva celebration with flaming torches, and they would juggle in their hands, and they would say before them passages of song of God and praise to God. And the Levites would play on lyres, harps, cymbals, and trumpets, and countless other musical instruments. So there was musical instrumentation in the Beis Hamikdash. You're thinking the Levium in general played music. It's really the Levium were more singers than musicians. So the idea of a Levi in general may not be precedent enough, but there clearly is precedent. Here we have that they would play again, this is a celebratory moment. It's not, the fact that music is accompanying the sacrifices of daily worship, but there was music for special occasions that deserved enhanced emotion. And so because of that celebration, they would have all these types of musical instruments that were there for singing and singing songs and praises to God. So as a threshold, instruments, musical accompaniment in the synagogue prayer worship service, there clearly is precedent. Now, just because there's something that was done in the temple doesn't necessarily mean it's meant to be replicated, but clearly if there was no problem in the temple, that there has to be some form of threshold allowance for this. Now, with regard to music in general, rabbinic, Talmudic sources and halakhic sources, for the most part, are negative on music in general. And this has to do with the destruction of the temple. In the aftermath of the destruction of the temple, the question was how to mourn appropriately. And so the Talmud in Bava Basra describes that there were those people who decided they were never going to eat meat or drink wine ever again. And they were questioned by their teacher, how can you do that? Why are you doing that? Well, they said there are no sacrifices and there are no wine libations in the temple anymore, so how can we have them eat and drink the wine? So he said, well, if that's the case, how can you have bread and water? Because there were flour offerings and water offerings. And there has to be a tempering of the morning while giving it its appropriate expression. And they kind of settled on the idea that there should not be too much joy and happiness and gladness at celebrations, to minimize celebrations, to remember the destruction in Jerusalem. So this gets expressed in Jewish law in source number 4. Similarly, the rabbis decreed not to play music with instruments and musical devices and all things that make music, to rejoice with it. It is forbidden to make them heard because of the destruction. Even song by mouth over wine is forbidden. You can't drink and sing at the same time, because in song one may not drink wine, as Isaiah said. So, and all of Israel is already accustomed to saying words of praise or song of thanks, remembering goodness, the Holy One, blessed be over wine. So, we kind of let people drink and sing if it's about praises. And similarly, for the need of a mitzvah, like for the house of a groom and bride, all this is permitted. So our listening to music has been impacted in general ever since the destruction. Remember, the Talmud is describing musical instruments as part of the worship, celebratory, spiritual services in the temple. Now that the temple is destroyed, maybe that puts an end to all musical instruments, including in the synagogue. The Shulchan Aruch opens up the idea that people have become accustomed to it, or certainly when there's a need for a mitzvah, like at a wedding. But the idea of the way we listen to music, is of dubious halachic reliability. It's not so clear that this is something that has strong legs to stand upon. A lot of it is discussed that we've gotten further and further away from the temple. We listen to music differently. A major distinction now is the fact that we have recorded music versus live music. A lot of music we listen to, unless we're at a concert, is recorded. The difference between live dance music and more classical music. Some music is more inspiring in nature versus joyous in nature. So there's been a lot of change in the attitudes towards music, but we see here two possible conflicting approaches with regards to music appearing in the Shul. So on the one hand, there were in the times of the temple, Beit HaMikdash, they had music and musical instruments to enhance their religious celebration. And after the destruction of the temple, we probably shouldn't be listening to music altogether, so any music seems to be limited. And so, unpacking this opposition by these rabbis with regards to these musical slichot services, generally we have to take both of those countering concepts in play to try and figure out where this opposition is coming from. Are they opposed to it because you can't have music in the temple, you can't have music in the synagogue, or at religious services, or are they opposed to it because you're not allowed to listen to music? So we need to unpack this a little bit, but first we'll stop if there are any questions, comments, or reactions.
Rabbi?
So, I think that for the most part, considering how permissive we've become in terms of listening to music, even though the temple is destroyed and we're meant to diminish our joy, really, what the major pivot in sensitivity for this seems to have emerged in the 19th century. And this is in the onset of some of the first reforms that were made to the classic halachic synagogues, especially the beginning of the 19th century in Hamburg, where you began to see some of the liberal synagogues in Germany. They didn't have reform yet. They just decided to make changes to Jewish law, where they had started introducing music. They started introducing organ music. Now, the introduction of that music in organs was not necessarily to make the worship nicer. It really was to kind of copy the churches of the time, so that the German synagogues would be more akin to the German churches in terms of That's also why they got rid of separate seating. They wanted family seating. They wanted the dignity of the service. Some would say the construction of synagogues also was impacted by the churches, but some of the earliest deviations from the way things had been done traditionally were the introduction of music, the organ, as well as using the vernacular. They started to speak the rabbi deliver sermons in German. And there was major, this was a major attraction to many German Jews who weren't necessarily overly pious or punctilious in ritual. And the ethos of the time of modernity made these new synagogues with their new construction, their new seating, their new approach, their new music, their new sermons in the vernacular, very appealing. And this led to a major debate within the Jewish world, and in particular the Central and Western European Jewish world. How do we respond? And it's part of a larger topic that we've spoken before, that there were basically three Jewish reactions or responses to the modern ethos of the time after in the Enlightenment. One was reform, one was change, was embrace it and go wherever it leads us, even if it moves us away from traditional Judaism. The other was oppose. Everything that they do is absolutely wrong. Often it's personified by the Rabbi Moshe Sofer, who we'll see a quote from it a little bit. The idea that Chadash Asur min HaTorah, taking that Talmudic expression with regards to agricultural law and saying anything that's being done, it's just forbidden. And then we'll figure out why it's forbidden. And then you have the more moderating approach, which is often, the first person people look at for that approach was Samson Raphael Hirsch, who was trying to adopt and adapt while remaining anchored in tradition. And so, basically, there was the questions were asked: can we have the synagogue have an organ? Can we have sermons in the vernacular? And for the most part, the more traditionalist rabbis began to respond very strongly: no, 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 no. We have to defend the faith. We have to, hold the line. We have to keep people anchored in tradition. And the only way to do that was to declare deviant all of these changes. And so the questions were asked among multiple rabbis. It's a larger topic that extended even beyond this particular issue. There's all sorts of issues that came about, but in particular the synagogue issue. Questions were sent to all of the rabbis, and responses were gathered. And a book was published, Eila Divrei Habris. These are the words of the covenant. And some of the sources that we're going to see, and just sources 6, 7, 8 come from that work, which was quoted extensively by the rabbinic establishment, throughout the 19th and 20th century. When the Rabbi Moshe Feinstein is asked questions, he still refers back to that. Mishnah Brura often refers to it. We'll see that maybe we've moved beyond that finally, although it seems, at least with regard to this issue, we're going to refer back to it. But just want to look at, before we look at some of those translations from that book, Rabbi David Tzvi Hoffman. Rabbi David Tzvi Hoffman was more in the Hirschian camp. Rabbi David Tzvi Hoffman was the author of Response and Malamed Lahoil. And he was a German rabbi and scholar. He was he was in the generation after Hirsch. He lived from 1843 to 1921. Someone who was trying to maintain tradition, but was also open to the modern ethos of the time. And he was asked the following question. It's there in the Hebrew, we'll translate it. There was a city that they decided to put an organ in the shul. And the rabbi there is trying his hardest to reverse that decision, but he's trying to, he's not able to do it. Maybe he can minimize the impacts of the decision and say, look, you want to have an organ, this is the second line, Yinagdu ba'argel b'mei hachol. You play it only on the weekdays. What's wrong with playing music on the weekdays, right? You can't play it on Shabbos, so you play it during the weekdays, right? He says like weddings and birthday, Yom Huledet Shel HaMelech, right? Where they celebrate the Kaiser's birthday. You're not going to violate Shabbos and the holidays. Also, well, what's the rabbi's calculus? he feels that if they let's say he quits in principle because of the organ, they'll get a rabbi that will be more liberal than he is. It won't be about just the organ. Who knows in what direction it will go? And therefore, the Rav wants to know if he can stay there and keep the organ and play it on the weekdays. So Rabbi David Tzvi Hoffman, and remember the fact that this was such a hot button issue that was leading to such passion that it for the most part, basically there was no way that there was going to be to just say it's permissible because in the temple they had an instrumentation. This was it wasn't just the halachic issue; it was the meta halachic issue. So he says, Rabbi Tzvi Hoffman says, where it says tshuva, right before I give my datenu haklusha, my simple opinion with regard to this, right? Especially because people have written, especially what has happened. The second line there, Be'ir Hamburg, right? 1819, what had taken place. And they've started to make many breaches in the tradition, and the court of Hamburg gathered many letters from all of the rabbis, and they came out with the book, and you see it there on the third line, Eila Divrei Habris, and there you have many rabbis, pious sages, holy ones, who have said that there are three sins involved in this, and one of them is you're not allowed to have you can't have any musical instrumentation, even if it's a non-Jew. He talks about even if it's a non-Jew, because there had been some tradition, and they say this was a synagogue in Prague that had a tradition of having musical instruments played on Friday evenings before sunset by non-Jews. Even though Jews could play it till then, the idea was that they would play into the Friday night service with music, and this preceded all of this, the rise of the Hamburg reformers. But it became such a hot button issue. So as Hoffman is reporting, the rabbi said, no, absolutely not, forbidden. And they said you're not allowed to have at all. But what about listening to the playing the organ on a weekday? Lo ra'isi haskama beinehem. I haven't found there to be a unified position, an agreement. And after I found three opinions. This is reminds me, my father tells me that when he was in Yeshiva University, one of the rabbis would give a test, and we would have a line from the Talmud, or a rabbinic line, and say true, false, or machlokas. Right, so it's kind of, sometimes you can always just say machlokas. It's a dispute if you can prove who the dispute is. So he says there are three opinions about whether or not you can have the organ playing on a weekday. So what do you think they're going to be? Probably mutter, usher, and maybe. Right, it's going to be allowed, forbidden, or maybe. So he says, right? Maybe we don't know. Some of them don't talk about it, so their silence is it omission or commission? Do they remain quiet about the weekdays because it's allowed, or quiet about weekdays because it's not allowed, or quiet about weekdays because they don't want to talk about it or they're not sure? Some say it's absolutely permissible to play music. That this is permissible on a weekday. Some say it's completely forbidden, whether it's weekday, whether it's Shabbos. So that's teeing up the issue, right? Rabbi Tzvi Hoffman is noting the complexity of the issue within the fraught environment that was taking place, in this, mid 19th century German Jewish community. So with regards to our issue, why the rabbi is so opposed to musical slichos, a couple of selections from Eila Divrei Habris. And whether they're halachic or whether they're philosophic is we'll have to analyze. So the Chassam Sofer, Rabbi Moshe Sofer, we see that our ancestors who established the davening did not ordain the use of musical instruments in davening, even though this use of music in davening began with us in the Beit HaMikdash service. Right? We saw that they had musical instruments in the temple service of Simchas Beis HaShoeva. Nevertheless, our ancestors abandoned it. It's thus evident that it did not meet their approval to utilize music and davening after the Korban. Due to the principle that from the day the Beis Hamikdash was destroyed, there's no joy before it. So Rabbi Moshe Sofer says, well, we don't really like listening to music, and we never have any indication that they use instruments after the temple, so it must be they rejected it in synagogues. You know, it's kind of like, you know, one of these statements is absolutely not up for debate, and the other two are a little bit vague, right? We know that there was opposition to music after the destruction of the temple. Yes, we know that that has gotten watered down over time also. The fact that they didn't have music in prayer services after the destruction is proof that they rejected it, is it? Right, well, what's the famous expression we use when we study Talmud? Lo ra'inu, just because we don't see it, ain't no raya. It's not, you can't definitively prove something there. So, but we see that Rabbi Sofer is taking the fact we haven't seen it and we don't like music, so we have to be opposed to instrumentation in the synagogue. And that was how he approached the reform issue. Well, we can see that being used for musical services of any sort today. We don't like music in general, and we never saw it before. I'm not sure it makes it like eating milk and meat like the Sephardic rabbi, but that's part of it. Next, Rabbi Mordechai Bennett, who was one of the contributors to this volume. He was a chief rabbi of Moravia in this period. He was one of the more senior rabbis. He lived 1753 to 1829. So, you know, 1819 is more towards the end of his life, just by comparison. Hirsch lived from until 1887. So there is, what does Rabbi Bennett contribute? He says, what mitzvah is there to play instruments during davening? It's actually inappropriate to commingle the joy of a strange service, instrumental music, with the joy of the soul at the time of reciting praise of song and might and power to our God. The song of the Levim was primarily vocal in the manner of our recitation of the Trup. And they would each sing each word according to its meaning and character. So what's Rabbi Bennett's opposition? Music and davening, it's not like chocolate and peanut butter that go together. They don't go together. And you want to say Levim? No, Levim were just davening. They had a tune, they had the right nusach, they used the right pronunciations, and they had, you know, they listened to the nusach tapes before they davened. They were doing it to make the words more meaningful. It wasn't being done to enhance the service. You know, so essentially, he's not saying that it's wrong, but what's so right about it? Oh yeah, add spirituality. He doesn't even address that issue. It's like music. Why add to it? And therefore, it's just. I guess the Jewish term would be it's pasnish. It doesn't belong, and it never was there, and doesn't belong. And let's just move on. Rabbi Yaakov Lorberbaum, another contributor to this, another contributor to Eile Divrei Habris, author of the famous rabbinic work, the Nesivos, on Choshen Mishpat. So he was the rabbi of Lisa, also, you know, one of the Zakenim at this time. So he, you know, kind of he is a little bit more anti this spirituality kick. With regard to davening, so I say, where do we find that joy during davening is a mitzvah? Who says you have to be happy? On the contrary, it's clear that obviously the primary object of our davening is atonement for sin. And how can we appear before God, King of the world, with musical instruments and joy, if we know that we are sinners? Right. This especially can, you know, be transferred over to the slichos discussion. Right. This is not the empowerment approach. You know, we're standing before God. This is kind of, we don't deserve to stand before God in the first place. You want us to enjoy it? You know, it's kind of a, you know, it's kind of, you know, kind of I would call it the grumpy old man approach. You know, not that he's a grumpy old man, but it's like, you know, Debbie Downer. We're not supposed to like it. We don't deserve to be here anyway. Now, look, the fact that we get to pray is a tremendous privilege, right? You know, Rabbi Soloveitchik very famously talks about we have to kind of ask permission before we can engage in davening, and that's why we have the Psalm 30 before Baruch She'amar. We're kind of asking permission before we can stand before God. But who says you're not allowed to enjoy it? But it seems very clear that there was the thrust of the opposition in the 19th century, what may have been anchored in this opposition or the prohibition against music. And then, for the most part, then went into other more philosophical discussions as to whether we should enjoy davening. We haven't seen it before. It's something that's new. The main halachic opposition is the fact that, that it was that it's music and we shouldn't be listening to music in general. Some would say that then, in particular, 19th century, and this also features prominently in Eila Divrei Abris, is the fact that some would say that it was Hukos Hagoyim, that the synagogues were imitating the churches, and that would be something that is prohibited on that level. But for the most part, these were meta halachic issues that were very much unique to then. And it kind of begs the question: why the opposition to the musical hakafas, musical slichos? Who are these gatherings imitating? They're not imitating non-Jews. Maybe it's similar to the fact that it's Jewish. Some of the Jewish communities that are more on the fringes are different from the communities that these rabbinic leaders represent. Right, the idea that Shlomo Carlebach was viewed a little bit on the fringes by many in the same communities that are opposing these musical slichos. Is it too much of a slippery slope that if these communities begin to adopt, let's say, some of the practices that the religious Zionist communities in Israel are having for slichos, is that too much a mingling of the sects, sects, that would be viewed as a negative thing? So we're kind of reopening the Orthodox and Reform controversies of the past and going to employ similar approaches. And, which is why I thought that Rabbi Nevin Zal is the rabbi of the Old City. And in one of his works, he has a series, Yerushalayim B'Moadeha, where he's talking about the high holidays. This is a translation from that. Is it permissible to sing part of the Slichot, source number 9, if this will help concentration and inspiration, similar to the way this is done for other parts of davening? Might this be permissible for outreach or educational purposes? Is there a difference between which types of tunes are utilized? Is there a difference between the verses and the poems of Slichot, right? Does it matter if we read the psukim or not? So, musical Slichos. So one can sing parts of Slichos if this helps with concentration. Right? He basically, if it helps, it's great. But it would seem that it's not so appropriate to sing the confession, right? So he says not so appropriate to sing the Ashanu Bagadnu. So what, of course, is everybody thinking? It's exactly what we do. Ashanu Bagadnu. So what about that? But look at his final clause: unless there's a custom to do so. Right? It's almost as if he also is cognizant of the fact that we sing our confession, and if we have that custom to do so, then it's fine. So I think that much of the opposition is we can kind of the more things change, the more they stay the same. Is a rehashing of the disputes that took place 200 years ago when these changes were first being made in the synagogues in Hamburg. And some of the language is very similar. Some of the arguments resonate and ring loudly as reverberating at this time. But if you cut through all of the politics, that is there anything wrong with it? The short answer is no. And maybe you should be more sensitive to certain parts and other parts. But even there, if the practice is to do so, then then stick with it. And so, in many ways, almost going back to the way Rabbi David Tzvi Hoffman presented the fact that, if the question is a weekday and that question isn't very specifically addressed, he invokes the different opinions. Maybe the fact that it wasn't addressed might mean it's completely forbidden, or the fact that it's not addressed means it's completely permissible. So the same thing could be over here with regards to the institution of these musical slichos. the idea that, look, it wasn't ever a question. It adds to the kavanah, go for it. However, if you see the dark specter of reform and changes that so adversely affected the Jewish community 200 years ago, that fear of that, the specter of that issue, I think is what led to the some of the more harsher responses that we saw in some of the headlines. So, but yeah, it has been tried in different places. I know places that's kind of, well, two examples, either as kind of an inspiration or a community engagement type of, maybe like a Kirov type of situation, like Reb Nebenzahl's question about, with regards to the slichos being for more of a Kirov purpose. What about Friday afternoon, if you're making early Shabbos, to have music as part of the Kabbalat Shabbat before transitioning into Shabbos? I think it still has been tried and is still out there, but it would still be. I have not encountered an Orthodox shul having kind of a regular Kabbalat Shabbat service that starts with music and then transitions. Definitely something that it would be off the beaten path. But I think that if you stick to the heart of the matter and on its merits, Reb Nebenzahl's asked and answered very straight and to the point response on this issue might be. Doesn't mean he would be so in favor of musical slichos. Sometimes you stick with the tradition, just keep it the way everyone's used to it. But there does seem to be some flexibility. If you just analyze the halachas, that it should be something that is permissible.